$180,000. That was the value of the cargo I lost without a single window being broken or a single scream being uttered. I wasn't held hostage. There was no chase. Nobody pointed a gun at me. I was standing there, engine off, signing a document confirming that the merchandise had been delivered, even though I knew something was wrong from the start. The truck was parked in a temporary holding yard while the insurance company assessed the damage. The cargo was officially listed as received at the correct dock, with a digital signature registered in the contracting company's system. The paperwork was in order. The time matched. The name of the person who checked the cargo existed in the system. The problem is that the most valuable boxes were simply no longer inside the trailer when the final inventory was taken. I mentally retraced every stop from the last 24 hours. No break-ins, no forced seal tampering, no sensor alerts. The refrigeration unit functioned normally the entire trip. The ELD, electronic logistics device, didn't register any significant deviations. Everything seemed too clean. The kind of theft that leaves no physical mark on the truck, only on the accounting report. It was only 2 days later, lying in bed trying to understand where I had gone wrong, that I remembered something too small to have mattered at the time. A white scratch, almost imperceptible, on the corner of my left rear light. I thought it was road grime. It wasn't dirt. It was the first stage of the scam. I returned a few hours before the incident to a busy gas station on the Tennessee border. Bright lighting, a constant flow of trucks, cameras visible on every fuel pump. It was the kind of place where you relax a bit because there's too much activity for anyone to try anything directly. I filled up, checked the tires, walked around the trailer as I always do. Nothing out of the ordinary. While I was having coffee inside, no one tried to open the trunk, didn't tamper with the seal, didn't force anything. What they did was simpler. A discreet scratch of white chalk on the corner of the left taillight, small enough to look like dirt, positioned high enough not to attract attention during the routine tire and axle check. It wasn't vandalism. It was information. Organized crime on the routes in that region no longer needs signal blockers or violent intrusions. They use temporary physical markings. Chalk, a finger in the dust, almost invisible transparent tape. The mark isn't a warning to the person making it. It's a code for those who come after. It indicates the driver's profile, stopping pattern, type of cargo, or even the isolation of the sensor unit. I didn't see anyone touch the truck. I didn't feel anything different when I returned to the cab. The mark was there, discreet, waiting to be read by another trained eye. I thought it was road grime. I partially wiped it off with my hand, but didn't erase it all. Without knowing it, I had already been cataloged. About 10 kilometers after leaving the gas station, already on a less illuminated stretch of the highway, a dark sedan slowly pulled alongside my left. The passenger gestured insistently, pointing behind my trailer. I did what any driver would do. I slowed down a little to hear better. He shouted something about smoke near the rear axle. It didn't seem like an exaggerated act. It seemed like hurried concern. I glanced quickly in the mirrors. I didn't see any obvious smoke, but the road was uneven and the reflection of the lights could be hiding something. Tires overheat. Brakes can lock up. A real mechanical problem can happen. I continued for a few meters trying to get a better look, but the car held its position. Too insistent to be a coincidence. It wasn't aggressive. It was convincing. I decided to pull over into a wide recess I knew from other trips, a spot without direct lighting but with enough space for safe maneuvering. I got out with a flashlight in hand and went straight to the tires and axles, following my automatic habit. I touched the rubber, felt the temperature, checked the air hoses. Nothing out of the ordinary. When I looked up at the back of the trailer, the sedan was no longer there. I returned to the cabin with the uneasy feeling of having been watched but not interfered with. There was no attempt to open the trunk. There was no direct approach. What I didn't realize at the time is that the recess where I stopped had exactly the blind spot necessary for someone to approach from behind for a few seconds. Not to steal everything, but to do something much more strategic. While I was checking the tires in that dark recess, no one tried to open the trunk. The seal remained intact the entire trip. What they did was more clever. On the chassis near the refrigeration unit support, Someone had attached a cheap magnetic tracker, one of those that cost less than a tank of diesel, small enough to go unnoticed in any common visual inspection. The chalk mark on the checkpoint wasn't for me. It was for the second group to know I was the right truck. That white line indicated that I was traveling alone, that I had a predictable habit of external checks focused on tires and axles, and that I didn't usually inspect the top of the trailer or the internal chassis. The pull-off where I stopped wasn't chosen by chance. It was chosen because it allowed for lateral approach without a camera or direct lighting. With the tracking device active, they no longer needed to follow me. They just had to wait. The system would show exactly where I would spend the night, or where I would unload. They didn't want the whole truck. They didn't want a confrontation. They wanted synchronization. They wanted to know where and when they could act within a seemingly legitimate environment. I continued my journey without noticing anything unusual. The load remained stable, the temperature correct, fuel consumption regular. The real change wasn't in the trailer. It was in the information now available to whoever was coordinating the scheme. I continued to believe I had only been the target of a possible false alarm about a low tire. In reality, I had already been integrated into a larger operation. I arrived at my destination on schedule. Large warehouse, seemingly organized operation, constant flow of trucks entering and leaving. Nothing out of the ordinary visually. A checker with a visible badge approached even before I had completely turned off the engine. He already knew my cargo number. He said there had been a slight change at the dock due to internal congestion. Dock changes happen. It's not uncommon. He directed me to a side area away from the main doors, claiming the team was speeding up unloading there for priority cargo. There was another truck positioned to create a partial visual barrier. The environment didn't seem improvised. It seemed part of the company's normal workflow. The seal was broken in front of me within the formal procedure. Document digitally signed, code scanned, superficial inspection of the first few rows. Nothing suggested irregularity. The unloading was too fast for the total volume, but the justification was the team's efficiency. I didn't monitor each box. I trusted the formality of the environment. Hours later, when the official inventory was cross-checked against the complete manifest, 4 high-value boxes were no longer there. The system recorded full delivery. The checker's name was there. The dock was registered. But the cameras in that area were temporarily under maintenance. The only thing that didn't appear in any report was the small white mark I had ignored on the flashlight 2 days earlier. Perfect. Now we can wrap things up with consequences and lessons, without excessive dramatization. Topic 6. What comes next? The tracker was found 3 days later, during a full inspection requested by the insurance company. Small, magnetic, attached in an area not part of the routine pre-trip check. There was no attempt at forced entry. There was no structural damage. Technically, I hadn't been robbed on the road. I had been driven to the right spot. The company that received the cargo existed. The loading dock existed. The checker wore a legitimate badge but was hired by a temporary third-party company that terminated its contract the following week. The dock change was recorded as an operational adjustment. Nothing in isolation was illegal enough to raise an immediate alarm. The scam worked because each step appeared to be part of a real system. They didn't need to block the signal. They didn't need to surrender. They didn't need to chase. They only needed temporary physical information, coordination, and patience. The chalk drawing was erased by the rain that same night. The sedan disappeared without a trace. The tracker cost less than a day's parking. The loss was almost $200,000. Since then, I no longer just look at tires and seals. I look at taillights, the roof of the cargo box, the internal chassis. What cost me dearly wasn't violence. It was predictability. And it all started with something I could have wiped away with a wet cloth before even leaving the gas station. For this channel to continue growing and for me to always bring the best reports, subscribe now and leave your like. This really helps the channel. Feel free to leave a comment. Where are you hearing this story from, and what time is it there now? I want to know who's on the road with me. Some things only start to make sense when you're lying there 2 days later, trying to understand why something seemed wrong. I was pulled over by an unmarked SUV on an empty stretch of Wyoming. It seemed like a normal inspection at first. Lights on the rearview mirror, shoulder of the road, standard procedure. But the way that man looked at my trailer wasn't the way he was looking for something wrong. He didn't want paperwork. He didn't want a fine. He was waiting for me to make a decision. A simple gesture. And if I had done it, the cargo wouldn't have reached its destination. The distance he kept wasn't the standard for a highway patrol car. He stayed a few meters further than usual, as if he didn't want immediate proximity to the rear of the truck. The lights flashed with irregular intensity. Too bright one moment, too dim the next, unlike the uniform pattern I had seen in state patrol cars. Still, obeying is automatic for those who live on the road. I signaled, gradually slowed down, and pulled over to the wide gravel shoulder, following the protocol that years of experience turned into reflex. Parking brake engaged, hazard lights on, ELD open on the main screen, window halfway down, hands visible on the steering wheel. This ritual protects more than it seems because it demonstrates cooperation even before any words are spoken. I wasn't nervous, just attentive. I had already gone through 3 inspections that month, and they all followed the same predictable pattern. Documents, hours of service, then external verification of the equipment. That's what I expected to repeat there. The SUV stopped misaligned with my rear axle, slightly offset to the right outside the classic angle used for safe approach and license plate visibility. The man got out slowly, his reflective vest too clean without wear on the edges or accumulated dust typical of a long road trip. He didn't look at me as he passed the cab, didn't ask for documents, didn't mention hours of work. He walked straight to the rear and stopped in front of the trunk seal as if he wasn't starting an inspection, but confirming something he already knew he would find. I got out of the cab keeping my hands visible, as is protocol for nighttime stops, but he didn't introduce himself or give a formal reason for stopping. The flashlight he was using was too small for a complete inspection and was focused exclusively on the seal, not on the hinges, not on the security bolts, not on the door structure. He was only illuminating the exact point where the metal sealed the load, as if that were the only relevant element in the entire trailer's composition. He asked me to confirm the seal number aloud, without requesting any documentation beforehand. No questions about the manifest, the origin of the cargo, or the responsible company. I read the digits while he brought his face close to the seal. Too close. Repeating each number with me as if he were memorizing, not verifying. There was no notepad, official tablet, or radio transmitting data. The confirmation took place only between my voice and his memory. In real inspections, the agent usually compares the number with the manifest he himself consults. There, he depended on me to validate the information. When I finished reading, he ran his thumb over the seal, pressing lightly as if testing its strength, not visual integrity. He didn't apply enough force to break it, but enough to feel tension. The gesture was too technical to be casual and too specific to be routine. He then indirectly inquired about the cargo's destination, as if confirming something he already knew. "Still heading to Denver?" he said, before I could mention any city. I instinctively confirmed. There was no large company logo on the truck to warrant immediate recognition. That information shouldn't have been available there, on that empty road, at that hour. He mentioned there had been a recent alert about cargo theft in that area, but he didn't cite an incident number, the responsible unit, or any formal reference that would lend technical weight to the statement. The phrase seemed too ready-made, generic enough to fit any situation. While he spoke, his eyes weren't fixed on me, but alternating between the seal and the road behind the truck, as if he were calculating time and exposure. The radio strapped to his shoulder remained completely silent. No static from the control center, no license plate requests, no code transmitted to record the stop. In real inspections, even the simplest ones, there is some kind of operational-based communication. There, the only source of light was his flashlight and the intermittent reflections of the SUV itself. The vehicle's engine seemed too quiet for prolonged idling. He took 2 steps back and said he needed to confirm the internal integrity of the cargo, citing the recent alert. The request was made casually, but without any mention of an official protocol, report number, or formal authorization to break the seal outside the loading dock. Opening the cargo container on the shoulder is not a common procedure without specific documentation, especially on an alternative route and outside the main corridor. I asked if he wanted me to break the seal right there. He said yes, but kept his distance, observing my reaction more than the equipment. He didn't position himself near the rear doors as someone who was actually going to conduct a physical inspection would. He stayed a few steps behind, as if expecting the driver to perform the irreversible part of the process alone. I knew that breaking the seal outside of an authorized dock automatically creates a record in the company's system. Even if the inspection is legitimate, the initial responsibility falls on the driver until the report is formalized. There on that empty road there was no official tablet, incident number, or any record being initiated. If I broke the seal, it would be my word against the lack of documentation. I said that first I would need to notify dispatch to register the extraordinary opening. I spoke in a technical, neutral way as if I were just following an internal manual. He didn't respond immediately. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the road. It was a calculated silence. For the first time he looked directly at me, assessing not the workload but the limits of my cooperation. He asked if I was refusing to cooperate with an official inspection. The question wasn't aggressive, but it carried enough implication to turn prudence into insubordination. If he was legitimate, questioning could lead to a negative report. If not, cooperating too much could pave the way for something bigger. The trap lay precisely in that gray area. He didn't approach the trunk, didn't request backup, didn't issue a direct order. He simply stood there for a few seconds longer than usual, as if waiting for the weight of authority to decide for me. The road remained deserted. No headlights appeared on the horizon. No witnesses emerged to turn it into an official scene. I repeated that I needed to register the opening before any seal was broken. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a confrontation. It was pure protocol. He kept his gaze fixed for a few seconds that seemed too long to be natural, as if he were assessing whether it was worth insisting or recalculating. His posture changed slightly. His shoulders were no longer relaxed, and the hand that had previously held the flashlight slowly descended to belt level. He didn't argue. He didn't demand anything. He didn't mention any penalty. He simply turned his body toward the SUV with a movement too controlled to be spontaneous. The lights continued flashing, but now they seemed more artificial than official. No radio call was made. No number was noted. No license plate was recorded aloud. The approach simply ceased to exist formally. When he got into the vehicle, there was no rush. The SUV remained stationary for a few more seconds, the engine still too quiet for a police car idling. Then the hazard lights switched off all at once, without a gradual transition. The vehicle slowly pulled away, resuming its journey down the road as if it had never stopped me. I stood on the shoulder of the road longer than necessary, not out of immediate fear, but to reorganize what had happened. If it had been a real inspection, there would have been some kind of record. If it had been a legitimate approach, I would have had an identification number. What remained was only the memory of the inverted order, the exclusive focus on the seal, and the clear attempt to make me break the only evidence of the cargo's integrity. I called dispatch while still on the shoulder of the road, and reported the incident with as much technical detail as possible. I asked if there was any authorized mobile operation on that secondary route. The answer was straightforward. No registered units, no active alerts in that area that morning. They asked for a description of the vehicle, a white SUV with no visible side markings, non-standard emergency lights. The call ended without an alarm, but with clear instructions not to break the seal outside of a controlled environment. 2 days later, already in another state, I received an internal company message reporting a similar incident on that same road. Another driver had been stopped by a vehicle with similar characteristics. Same focus on the seal. Same request for immediate opening under the vague justification of a regional violation. He broke the seal before notifying headquarters. The cargo wasn't taken there immediately. It was partially diverted hours later during an unsupervised stop. No violence, no confrontation, no pursuit. Just a procedure that deviated from the norm. The broken seal legitimized the subsequent chain of events. When there is a record of an opening outside the dock, the initial responsibility is no longer questioned in the same way. Vulnerability begins with the technical detail, not the direct assault. The road doesn't need weapons when it has a poorly directed protocol. Today, when I see lights in my rear-view mirror on an isolated stretch of road, I don't first think about a fine. I think about the order of the questions. I think about who checks the documents before the seal is applied. I think about who registers before requesting the seal be broken. That night there was no visible crime, but there was a clear intention. It wasn't an inspection. It was an attempt to make me remove the only barrier that prevented the cargo from ceasing to be my responsibility and becoming merely an opportunity. You know that feeling of entering an empty place and still feeling like you're not alone? I was crossing Kansas on a straight stretch that was too long to have any surprises when I started to notice the steering wheel pulling slightly to the left. It wasn't anything abrupt. It was just a subtle tilt about 2 degrees. But anyone who drives the same truck every day learns to feel even the slightest difference in weight. The dashboard showed no signs of life. Tire pressure was within normal limits. Temperature was normal. Fuel consumption was stable. I know my setup well enough to recognize crosswinds or uneven road surfaces. That wasn't a road. It was load behavior. And it didn't match what I had signed in the manifest a few hours earlier. I started doing automatic mental calculations like every driver does without realizing it. Weight distribution, pallet position, driven axle. Nothing justified that slight constant compression in the left suspension. It wasn't enough to trigger an alert on a regular scale, but it was enough to bother someone paying attention. It was there, still at 80 km/h, that the sensation ceased to be technical and became instinct. It didn't seem like a mechanical failure. It seemed like a presence, as if there was something there that wasn't on the drawing board, occupying space that I hadn't authorized it to occupy. The shipping cost was too good to refuse. It was almost double the average for that route, and payment was guaranteed even before I left the yard. The logistics company had a professional website, an address in a prime area, and a representative who spoke with too much precision to seem improvised. Everything conveyed stability, perhaps too much stability. The collection took place in a clean, organized warehouse with an air-conditioned reception area and digital signature via a modern tablet. No crumpled paper or makeshift loading dock. Even so, when they handed me the printed manifest as a backup copy, I noticed a small detail: the strong smell of freshly printed ink. It wasn't excessive. It just stood out from the rest of the operation. While waiting for loading, I noticed there was no clear fleet identification in the yard, just trucks coming and going without a defined visual pattern. I didn't see any repeated uniforms, nor any fixed signage on the walls. The place seemed set up to appear permanent, but it lacked the signs of accumulated use. It was too clean, too organized, almost temporary. At the time, I ignored it. Good freight, sealed cargo, signed documentation. I had no concrete reason to be suspicious. But that smell of cheap ink in the middle of an operation that tried to look corporate stuck in my memory like a loose piece. It didn't make sense yet. It was just another detail too small to justify concern. Midway through my journey, I stopped for my mandatory rest in a large parking lot, one of those that mix trucks from different companies without much regard for the rules. I got out to stretch my legs and, out of habit, walked around the group. That's when I saw my reflection in the side window of another trailer parked next to it, and something seemed out of place. My company's sticker on the side of the truck bed had a small air bubble in the upper left corner. I have a habit of noticing these things because I've had to replace stickers before. This morning, when I left the pickup, that surface was smooth. Now there was a slight, almost imperceptible ripple, as if something had been applied over it. I reached out and felt the different texture under my fingertips. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't wear. It was an overlay. From a distance, the logo remained the same, but the finish wasn't the same. Someone glancing quickly would see my company. Someone who knew exactly what to look for might see something else. I went back to the cabin trying to rationalize. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was just temperature variation expanding the vinyl. But the discomfort returned when I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that, depending on the angle, the color of the sticker reflected slightly differently. Too small to reveal fraud. Too big to ignore completely. The sensation at the wheel returned a few hours later, more noticeable than before. It wasn't enough to compromise my driving, but enough to make me slow down and observe the car's behavior more closely. That's when I decided to voluntarily go through a moving way station that I would normally avoid if I were within my weight limit. I needed the number, not the feeling. The digital display showed just over 500 pounds more than what was on the manifest. It wasn't a glaring excess, but it was a real difference. The kind of variation that could be explained by a dock error, or something that wasn't listed. The agent let me through without question, because I was still within the acceptable margin. But that number stuck in my mind. When I got back on the road, I noticed a black car stopped a few kilometers past the way station, parked in an unofficial pull-off area. It hadn't been there before. As I passed, I felt the driver had been watching the truck for too long. There was no immediate pursuit, just strategic loitering. It was at that moment that the mosaic began to take shape. The freight was too perfect. The smell of ink on the manifest, the bubble in the sticker, the extra weight that wasn't on the paper, and a vehicle waiting just past the point where any irregularity would have been officially detected. I still didn't know what I was transporting, but I already knew I wasn't alone on that route. I pulled off the highway at the first well-lit area I found and parked in a spot where the cameras were visible. It wasn't paranoia. It was calculation. If I was wrong, I'd lose a few minutes. If I was right, I needed to be in a place where any movement would be recorded. I got out with a flashlight and started inspecting more than I normally do. I climbed onto the side of the trailer using the spare tire carrier to reach the top edge. That's where I saw the first detail that couldn't be ignored. Screws on the false roof with recent wrench marks. They weren't damaged, just shinier than the rest of the structure. This wasn't part of routine maintenance on a sealed cargo vehicle. I went down and went to the inner chassis near the refrigeration unit. Among cables and supports, there was a package wrapped in insulating material, secured with cable ties that were too new to have been there for very long. I didn't need to open it to understand that it wasn't listed on the manifest. I hadn't loaded it. I hadn't authorized it. At that moment, I understood the different weight, the tilt, the excessive care taken in collecting the goods, the altered sticker. It wasn't about stealing my cargo. It was about using my clean record, my predictable route, and my regular truck to cross a state with something that would never pass inspection if it were in a suspicious vehicle. I wasn't the target. I was the transport. I didn't touch the package. I didn't try to remove anything. I went back to the cabin and called the State Highway Patrol directly, explaining exactly what I had found and where I was parked. I didn't use the word drugs. I didn't make assumptions. I only reported weight discrepancy, unauthorized structural modification, and foreign material attached to the chassis. I needed the record to begin before any alternative narrative could be constructed. The minutes until the police car arrived seemed longer than any stretch of the highway. I knew that to an outsider, I looked like the driver of a seemingly legitimate truck with illicit material hidden in its structure. If that black car had been monitoring me, they would know I had stopped outside of my planned route. But at that point, my name needed to be associated with the complaint, not the seizure. When the agents arrived, they conducted a thorough inspection and dismantled part of the false ceiling. What they found there wasn't in the manifest. It wasn't at the dock. It wasn't in any contract. The logistics company disappeared in less than 48 hours. The physical address was a virtual office. The website went offline. The phone number ceased to exist. The final report made it clear that I had been used as unwitting transport. My clean record was what made the route viable for whoever organized it. No fines, no formal charges against me. But the investigation lasted for weeks, and each stop I made during that period carried a different weight, because I knew I could have ended up in handcuffs before I could explain anything. What bothered me most wasn't the risk of arrest. It was realizing how easy it would have been to ignore those 2 degrees on the steering wheel. If I had continued driving without questioning the weight, I would have crossed another state line with it hidden above my head. At some point further on, I would have been stopped, and in that scenario, I wouldn't have been able to prove that I wasn't part of the plan. Today, I don't trust overly perfect shipping, overly clean pickup, or stickers that shine differently in the sun. What saved me wasn't courage. It was technical discomfort. 2 degrees of incline that I could have ignored. Sometimes what seems like paranoia is just experience warning that some piece of the mosaic is out of place. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, because that's what makes the channel grow and helps me to always bring the best reports for you. If you haven't commented yet, let me know. Where did you hear these stories, and what time is it now? I read all the comments from those who stay with me until the very last kilometer. Thanks for the company. Keep your eyes on the road and your windows locked. See you in the next video. Have a good trip.